Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you Congressman Carlos Curbelo, the son of political refugees who fled tyranny and oppression in Cuba, rising to hold office in the U.S. House of Representatives as the congressman representing Florida's 26th congressional district. While in Congress, he has led on climate policy, immigration reform, and gun safety. He co-founded and co-chaired the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, served in a leadership role in the Problem Solvers Caucus, and led the Brazil Caucus to strengthen the bilateral relationship with Latin America's leading economy. During today's conversation, Congressman Curbelo discusses how conservatives should approach climate change and how his bipartisan approach to politics stems from Reaganite principles. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program with Congressman Carlos Curbelo and Reagan Institute Policy Director Rachel Hoff.
Welcome to Reaganism. I'm your guest host, Rachel Hoff, Policy Director at the Ronald Reagan Institute. Thank you so much to Congressman Carlos Curbelo for joining us today. Congressman Curbelo served for 4 years in Congress and gained such a reputation so quickly as a real leader on a bipartisan basis on a number of issues that I know we'll talk about today, from climate change to immigration reform to gun safety and LGBT issues. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. It's good to be with you. And Reagan Institute, I mean, it's kind of like a dream come true for me.
Well, we love to hear that.
Hero.
We love to hear that. I'd love to start actually by pulling the thread on part of President Reagan's legacy that connects with your own story, just by telling us a bit about your family. Your parents were political refugees from Cuba. Tell us about their story and how they came to America and where you fit in with that.
Yeah, my parents came from Cuba in the early 60s. They were exiled from their country. They didn't agree with the Castro Revolution, and anyone who was opposed to the revolution was a target of the revolution. So my family lost everything. They lost their home, they lost most of their belongings, and they came to this country wanting an opportunity to work and to be free. That's all they wanted. Nothing less, nothing more. And this country was extremely generous to them. I mean, it was not easy. They struggled early on. My dad experienced hunger in America. Never complained about it, but it was just the nature of the refugee experience. Eventually got on their feet, and about 20 years later, after my parents arrived in this country and other people in my family, Ronald Reagan, that's when Ronald Reagan started emerging as a powerful national figure. And for Cuban Americans, he was really the first American politician who unapologetically stood with them and said, we, stand with the Cuban people. We want human rights to be respected in Cuba. The United States stands with the Cuban exile community. And that was just a tremendous validation for the Cuban American community, for my family. And really that's where the relationship between Cuban Americans and American conservatism began with Ronald Reagan. So to this day, there are many people in South Florida and the Cuban American community for whom Ronald Reagan is the most important political public figure, the person they admire and appreciate the most.
Now, of course, the context of the end of the Cold War was it President Reagan's his rhetoric was always so strong in the context of the Cold War, of course, against communism and in favor of freedom. Was it that? Was it support for particular political dissidents? Was it active policies that opposed oppressive regimes, or what did you find people really identified with?
So I would say it was all of that, but most of all it was his moral clarity. Like there was no doubt that Ronald Reagan was always on the good side. That Ronald Reagan was always with the good guys, and whether it meant in the context of the Soviet Empire, he spoke plainly and clearly, with respect, with eloquence, but plainly and clearly. You didn't have to figure out what he was saying, and for a community that they lost so much. Again, Cuban Americans, right? They lost everything but their lives, and some of them lost their lives. To have someone speaking unequivocally in favor of them was just extraordinary, because Carter administration believed that they needed to engage, appease the Cuban regime. That was deeply offensive to a lot of Cuban Americans. So Reagan was just it was probably the biggest thing that happened to the U.S. Cuban community.
Yeah. Now, you are probably a little bit young to remember the Reagan administration yourself, but that helps sort of set the context for maybe identifying some threads to your own worldview. I think you also had a Jesuit education, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
How did that shape your worldview, if at all?
So the Jesuits, and these Jesuits are unique because it's quite interesting. The Jesuit school I went to was established in Havana, Cuba in 1854 by the Queen of Spain. Fidel Castro attended that school, and then Fidel Castro took power and expelled all religious orders, including his own alma mater, and that school then settled in Miami, and it is still today technically a school in exile. The Jesuits teach you, and they do it. They don't do it overtly. They kind of, carefully and quietly teach you to care about things beyond the walls of your home. They encourage you to care about your community, to care about world affairs, and they encourage you to be a protagonist in the world, to engage. And so that, I think, my 7 years in a Jesuit school really shaped me a lot and pushed me into public life.
Yeah, so it's easy to see the seeds of your public life. Talk to us a bit about your decision to first run for public office. So you served on the Miami-Dade County School Board before you were in Congress. That first decision to run, what was that about for you?
So I was never, I think, some people growing up and maybe in college discover that they have a thirst for public office and that they're attracted to the idea of running for office. That was never me. I was always involved in politics. I did my first congressional internship when I was 15, and then I was a page in Congress when I was 16. I always enjoyed it. I had a passion for it, but I always thought of myself as a behind-the-scenes type, not someone who would actually run for office. And then in 2010, a group of friends came to me and said, "Hey, there's this school board opening because someone had resigned to run for another office in your district, and you should consider it." So I thought about it, spoke to my wife. I decided not to do it. A couple months later, they came back and said, "Hey, you'd be a great candidate. We don't think there are too many good candidates running. You should do it." I thought about it again, and I said, "All right." I kind of convinced myself to do it. something that helped me was that school board terms are usually 4 years, but this was an interrupted term, so I said to myself, well, worst case, it's 2 years, and then I don't have to run again. But I ran, I won, and had a wonderful experience on the Miami-Dade County School Board. It was a tough time for local governments. It was right after the Great Recession of 08-09. Local budgets were strained. And in Miami-Dade, under the leadership of a great superintendent and my colleagues on the board, we were able to cut bureaucracy and administration, actually give teachers raises despite the economic downturn. We expanded school choice within the district. It was just so rewarding, and it made me believe in government as a potential force for good in society. So it was a wonderful 4 years. I learned a lot. I think I grew a lot. And then, much like in 2010, 2014, Republicans had lost the congressional district I lived in 2012. And I went to two friends who I thought would make great candidates. I encouraged them to run because I thought we should have a good Republican running for that district. They both said no. And then I was like, all right, then I'm going to do it. And I did, and that was the beginning of my time.
The rest is history. We'll have to go back and thank those local folks that wouldn't take no for an answer when you ran for school board. You talk about the wonderful and kind of enriching experience of solving problems on the school board. Compare and contrast that with your time in Congress.
Well, I'll say in many ways, serving on the school board was more fulfilling in the sense that it was easier to get things done. Mm-hmm. You could vote for a policy and a few weeks later visit a school and see it in action. That doesn't happen even during good times in Congress, right? Oftentimes it takes many years to see the results of whatever you worked on in Congress. And also, it does help that the school board of Miami-Dade has 9 members. The House of Representatives has 435.
A few more.
It's a bit more complicated. But I'll tell you, even though some parts of it were difficult and frustrating, serving in Congress was just a spectacular experience. I tell people, I'm the child of political refugees. My parents, when they came to this country, could not had even dreamed of a child of theirs serving on the board of directors of the United States of America. So what really shocks me the most when I think about it is how generous and good this country is. I mean, I know we've focused a lot recently for some good reasons on some of our country's flaws, but this is the greatest country in the world, and the fact that, not because it's me, but that the child of refugees could be a policymaker in America is just fascinating.
Yeah, the American dream.
Yeah.
So you come into Congress, you go to work and gain this reputation as a bipartisan leader. You were rated the 4th most bipartisan member of Congress from both parties during your time there. And your constituents actually reward you with re-election. That's not perhaps a very common story in Washington these days, that bipartisanship and working across the aisle to achieve results gets rewarded, right? There's so much polarization where our political system seems to reward other things, other ways of doing business. So how did you pull that off? And is there something about you or the work you were doing or your district that allowed for that? Well,
I was blessed in 2 ways. Number one, it's just my nature, my DNA to try to bring people together. I like to find common ground. It's just my nature. I did on the school board when we didn't run as Republicans or Democrats on the school board, but I was still a bridge builder in many ways, and then it was natural to keep doing that in Congress. The other way that I was blessed is that I represented a swing district. I actually, in my last term, represented the most Democratic-leaning district in the entire country, held by a Republican. And in 2016, as you alluded to, I'm so grateful to the people of my district because the president, Donald Trump, lost my district by 16 points that year, and I won my district by 12. And to me, that meant that there were a lot of people in my district who voted for the person over the party. And they liked that I reached across the aisle. And even in 2018, where I came up just a couple points short, in such a tough district for Republicans, it was a really close race, right? A virtual tie. And that's because in my South Florida community, people reward those who try to build bridges, those who understand that it's very hard to get everything that you would like or that you want or that you need, but if you can get a good amount of it, it's okay to let the other person have some of what they would like and what they need as well. And did a lot of work in Congress to try to build dialogue and consensus on issues like climate change, immigration, gun safety. I used to tell people, we only deal with the easy issues here in this office, and it took a lot of work. I have some scars as a result, but I don't regret it at all. I know that I contributed to the institution, and we really need more people with that disposition in Congress. We had
Congressman Hurd on the podcast recently, and he talked in similar ways about the need to do that hard work. I hear you hinting at that dirty word of compromise these days. And Congressman Hurd talked about his district and yours similarly being, kind of 50-50 districts or close there. So many members of Congress don't come from 50-50 districts, and so they don't have that incentive structure back home to do the hard work that you've worked on in your time in Congress. Is there anything we can do to change that incentive structure to make that possible for more members of Congress?
Yeah, so I'm involved now with a number of groups. Maybe the most prominent is a group called Unite America that is focused on structural reforms to properly align the incentives in our government. So, why are we where we are today? There are many reasons for it. I think the media and the polarization of the media has become a major driver of this. Cable networks reward the members who make headlines, and the easiest way to make headlines is by insulting someone, by refusing to compromise, by bringing Congress to a grinding halt, shutting down the government. This is how you get on TV. And a lot of politicians like to get on TV. So, look, everyone's responsible for their own actions, but obviously there's an environment and an alignment of incentives that's perverse and that is encouraging people to act in this way. So there are a few important ideas out there about how to make this better. I think reapportionment reform is one of them. I mean, if you only draw red districts or only blue districts, it's very hard to get any kind of find any kind of common ground. Open primaries, we've disenfranchised, and it's a horrible cycle because especially young voters have become so disgusted by our politics that they're refusing to register with either party. In doing so, they're excluding themselves, or the system excludes them from participating, certainly in primaries. So I believe in open primaries. I think ranked choice voting is a good solution that we need to pursue, and this will include more people in our democracy, and it will yield better outcomes. I mean, our institutions, I always tell people, institutions are more important than people. My parents' country, there was a collapse of institutions, and they elevated one person above all the institutions. Obviously, that's horrible. But even when you have strong institutions, as we do, those institutions rely on good people as well, or on people, I don't want to say good or bad people, but on people who
Maybe
have
come
a
from
good
good faith.
disposition,
Yeah.
who are acting in good faith, who want to advance the national project.
Yeah, and I hear you're pointing there to real systemic changes, which that it runs deep.
Yeah. By the way, another important change. It's not just electoral changes, changes in the way we run our elections, but the institution of the House has to change. Leadership has become too powerful in the U.S. House of Representatives. I always would tell my colleagues, if we were all allowed to negotiate and to legislate, things would work better here. But, the leadership of both parties dedicates a lot of their time and efforts to suppressing member initiatives. Hey, so-and-so is working with some Democrats on this. Let's stop that and make sure we don't lose control of the issue. Leaders should be facilitating opportunities for members to work together, not being selfish and blocking all of that activity, just so that they can be the ones to determine everything. You and I spoke. I don't know if you were going to ask me, but I'll give you an example. In this Congress, right now, the 116th Congress, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Richie Neal, after I lost my election, invited me to testify at Ways and Means on climate change because he thought I could be a positive voice in that hearing, be a positive influence on my former Republican colleagues on the committee. Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer went to Chairman Neal and said, "You are not allowed to invite Carlos Curbelo. You must withdraw that invitation immediately." Think about that. A committee chairman has no authority to invite witnesses to his committee.
And the same party, of course. Chairman, leadership, all the same party.
Exactly. Without the approval of the leadership. That's just, it's very hard to do big things, to pass major policy, to build the consensus you need to advance in that kind of environment.
Yeah. Well, one issue in particular that you did find a way to lead on while you were in Congress is climate change. And this podcast is dedicated to talking about the complex challenges we face today and where we can determine President Reagan's core principles and vision can inform how we approach those problems. And I think it's probably safe to say that there are very few challenges more complex than climate change. Why did you choose to take that on as a signature issue during your time in Congress and even after?
So never in my life was I this huge enthusiastic environmentalist. I mean, I always cared about the environment. I knew a lot about the Everglades because it's next door to us in South Florida, and of course the ocean's on the other side. So I always appreciated the environment, but it was never one of my great passions. Then I got to Congress. I had a meeting with scientists of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they went through some of the data related to my district, risks associated with climate change, sea level rise, what it would mean for the Florida Keys and other parts of my district. And I was shocked by all of that information, and I just said, wow, whether I want to or not, I have to lead on this issue because my community needs leadership and needs for this to be addressed. So got to work, started recruiting fellow Republicans who knew about the issue, cared about it. There weren't very many. And then just dedicated pretty much the next 3.5 years of my time in Congress to raising awareness and building consensus. Co-founded the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus in the House, the first bipartisan organization inside the Congress dedicated to discussing and addressing climate change. That group started off very modestly. We only had 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats at the end of the 114th Congress in 2016. By 2018, we had 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats. So, from 4 to 5, who, when I started recruiting, were willing to engage on the issue, we got to 45 on the Republican side, and I give credit to the 45 Democrats who were willing to join us as well. And that was the birth of something important in the Congress. It really pushed Republicans, encouraged them to start taking the issue seriously for the first time. We would have meetings, bring in witnesses, government officials from other countries, fossil fuel company executives, environmental groups, and we just took a very sober approach to the issue, and there was a lot of growth, and we're seeing that still pay off today. I mean, Leader McCarthy in the House convened a conference meeting where all the House Republicans attend to discuss climate change. Leader McCarthy has put out a package of bills that constitute the Republican response to climate change. So for a party that just 2 or 3 years ago dismissed this issue, didn't care about it, wouldn't talk about it, now they're saying that they're going to solve it. That's how you measure progress in Congress. Nothing has passed, but there's been a lot of growth.
Yeah. Let's drill down a little bit more into the policy implications there. So, as you worked on the Bipartisan Caucus and particularly getting Republicans on board with the cause, what did you find emerged as what the conservative approach to climate change should be, and then kind of some particular policies that are born out of conservative principles that could be supported to address the issue?
So look, there are a lot of policy options out there. There are tax incentives. I've been supportive of those. We've had some tax incentives in place for some years to help the solar industry get on its feet, to help the wind energy sector get on its feet. Those are all good. Other people talk about public investment and research and development, but budgets in that area have gotten more resources. That's all good. I support a lot of different policy. I think as long as you're contributing to the goal of reducing carbon emissions, accelerating the transition to a clean energy economy, I think that's good. Now, in my view, the most efficient and effective policy instrument is to price carbon. And I also think it's honest and transparent. And look, very much in the Reagan legacy, President Reagan never ignored problems. Whatever emerging conflicts were happening throughout the world, issues that worried people, that could put our national security interests at risk, he was willing to engage and to identify them, right? That plain language that we spoke about earlier, tear down this wall, the evil empire, let's identify the problem, let's call it what it is, and then let's start working to address it. Well, climate change is real, it's a real threat, it's a real challenge, and it requires a global solution. If we were to fully decarbonize our economy tomorrow and the rest of the world did nothing, it wouldn't solve much. So that makes it a little more complex. It's kind of like nuclear proliferation and other issues where you kind of need everyone to cooperate. So that's why I think that pricing carbon is such a powerful policy instrument. Number one, it's rooted in conservative economics. There is a cost to carbon emissions. We're paying for it in South Florida already. We're having to elevate roads, install pump systems just to deal with tidal flooding, seawalls, all of that. Other parts of the country are dealing with it in other ways. Extreme weather and changing climate patterns as a result of carbon emissions are hurting ag communities and raising all sorts of challenges for farmers all across our country. So the solution has to be comprehensive, and it has to be powerful, and it has to compel the rest of the world to follow. And if you identify the price of carbon emissions, represent it in the economy so that people know how much it costs, what the consequences of it are, then you actually start solving the problem, and you can get the government out of the way and trust the American people and American businesses and American enterprise to solve climate change. Because what are American businesses going to do? What does capitalism do? People look for the way to succeed as efficiently as possible. People are looking to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. We like that. We just want to make sure that the economy is fair and open and transparent, and that's the goal here. And then in terms of compelling the rest of the world to follow, and this conversation about carbon pricing can grow technical quickly, but a key component of any price on carbon, which is essentially a tax on carbon emissions, is for you to adjust at the border. What does that mean? Let's say China does not have a policy in place to reduce carbon emissions, to tax carbon dioxide. We are going to put their imports, their goods, at a disadvantage as they come into the United States. We're not going to punish our own people for doing the right thing. On the contrary, we're going to reward them because we're going to tax Chinese goods or any country that doesn't price carbon as they come in. And then our exports, if we're exporting to China, we will give our exporters a credit at the border on their way out so that the increased cost from carbon pricing in the United States is not something that makes it harder for American companies and entrepreneurs to sell their products abroad. So anyway, this is complex, but the powerful thing about it is that it does not require us to trust any other country to do the right thing when it comes to carbon emissions. It compels them to follow our leadership because whether it's China, India, any of the other major polluters in the world, they are going to want to sell their products, their goods and services in the United States. And if they're going to want to do that, they're going to have responsible climate policies in place that guarantee we can solve this issue for the whole world and for future generations.
So we're talking about two things here, carbon pricing and then the border adjustment. And they, I'm going to try to simplify it, an issue that you're so much more of an expert on than me, but the carbon pricing is kind of the domestic component, and then the border adjustment is how to get the rest of the world on board. Both of them, though, are taxes, right? If you're pricing carbon, the implication is, there's going to be a tax on it, and then the border adjustment is a tax on imports. So I'm channeling some of our Reaganism podcast listeners out there who might be thinking, how can they square the circle of a conservative approach or one in Ronald Reagan's legacy that involves taxes? How would you respond to that?
Well, look, I have cred on tax policy.
Yes, you do.
I was one of the original co-authors of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which in many ways was inspired by the Reagan tax reforms of the mid-'80s, specifically the 1986 Comprehensive Tax Reform Bill. As a matter of fact, I went to the Reagan Ranch as we were preparing to file our legislation, which was quite the experience, one of the most special of my life. So I'm for low taxes. I'm generally not for new taxes, but conservatives know that smart taxes and fair taxes are better than other taxes. Or another way to say that is that not all taxes are created equal. And certainly the idea of a consumption tax has been attractive for conservatives for a very long time. And a tax on carbon is a consumption tax. We are taxing, instead of arbitrarily, as we do with income taxes, for example, we are taxing based on consumption. Carbon emissions are bad for the economy, are bad for the environment, pose a serious threat to future generations of Americans. We want to reduce that, so we tax it, and we can alleviate then taxes in other areas where we don't want to attack things. So fundamental conservative economic principle is if you want less of something, tax it. Well, we don't want less income for people, so a carbon tax with this border adjustment tax component allows you to reduce other kinds of taxes. It allows you to swap out income taxes, for example, for this consumption tax, which has the added benefit of securing a healthy, clean planet for future generations. So, for example, in the carbon pricing bill that I filed, we repealed the gasoline tax because we believe, and it's a fact, that the gasoline tax is regressive. You know, the wealthier you are, the more efficient a vehicle you can afford. Or maybe you can even afford a vehicle that doesn't consume any gasoline, right? But lower income Americans typically have older cars that don't use gasoline as efficiently, so they get punished by the gasoline tax. Carbon pricing is different. It provides people an incentive to reduce their carbon footprint, but it treats everyone more equitably. So if you're, a rich guy and you have a Tesla and you're plugging into a coal power plant, you're still going to contribute. You're going to have to pay taxes. Today, that person doesn't pay any taxes into the Highway Trust Fund, for example. So, yes, Republican knee-jerk reaction would be to oppose this. I get that. When I first heard about it, I wasn't necessarily a fan. The more I learned about it, the more I understood that, number one, this is a very logical and fair way of taxing. And number two, it gives us the opportunity to deliver tax relief to American families who need it, and to stop disincentivizing work, which is what allows people to earn an income. So, we could probably spend 3 hours on this. It's not an easy topic, but once people research it and understand it, they realize that this could generate multiple wins. It could reduce taxes for a lot of American families. It secures a healthy planet for future generations. And it will accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy, which means all sorts of new jobs and opportunities that we can't even begin to imagine today.
I've got one more question on climate change, and then I want to move on to some questions about the future of the conservative movement and the Republican Party. As you've engaged on the issue of climate change, it's one that's incredibly polarized between the far left and the far right. There's still a segment of climate change denialism on the right, and of course on the left, some fairly radical proposals for how to solve the issue. You've laid out what seems like a sensible middle ground that's rooted in some conservative policies. I'm sure there's a center-left analog to that. Is there a constituency, a political constituency, for reasonable, sensible, maybe steps in the right direction as opposed to nothing at all or extremely radical reform?
There certainly is when you take the country as a whole. Now, when you're talking primary elections, there isn't. And that, we get back to the structural challenges that we face in this country, and that really the majority of Americans become excluded or disenfranchised from the system because we get Republicans and Democrats catering to maybe 15% of the people who participate in elections, as opposed to everyone, or at least a majority of people. So here's where the growing constituency is on this issue, and the growth is guaranteed because it's young people, younger generations, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, libertarian, who care about this issue. Why? Because they know it's about them. If we do nothing, we know that our children and grandchildren are going to face major challenges in the future. It's what I tell my Republican, colleagues, former colleagues, is the same way we talk about the national debt and how it's a burden on future generations and how it will lead to a less prosperous future for rising generations, it's the same with climate and the environment. Think of the environmental debt we're building in terms of the fiscal debt that we're building in the country. And if we continue emitting carbon dioxide at the rates we're doing today, that's going to punish our children, our grandchildren, and their children. And that's never what our country's been about. I mean, part of the Reagan mantra is that each generation will be better off than the last, and that's what we want. And that's why I care about this issue. I mean, chances are, during my lifetime, I like to think of myself as still being young, but I'm kind of getting to halftime, as I say. Things will probably be okay, maybe not. But for my daughters, there will be real challenges if we do nothing. Sea levels will continue rising, communities will be displaced, economic growth will be reduced. This will provoke countries to invade other countries. There will be mass migrations of people. There will be more extreme weather events. I mean, we're already seeing that in the United States. I live in South Florida. I always tell my Democratic friends, who tend to be a lot more alarmist about all of this, stop saying that climate change is causing hurricanes. We've had hurricanes in South Florida for as long as there's a recorded history of South Florida, right? Hundreds of years. Now, it is true that the strength, size, and frequency of hurricanes is rising drastically. And we know that warmer water temperatures fuel hurricanes. I mean, there's a lot of basic science here that you can be a guy like me who's not all that bright and figure out. And this is not good. Powerful hurricanes are not good for South Florida or for any part of the world. So we want to stop what's causing that as soon as possible without wrecking our economy and without punishing ourselves.
Beyond climate change, you led in Congress on issues like immigration reform, gun safety, LGBT rights, inequality. Looking at that record, some might call you a moderate Republican. Do you identify as a moderate Republican, or do you support those issues for conservative reasons?
Look, I don't like labels. If I was forced to, I'd say I'm a centrist Republican. But Republicans, I haven't heard in a long time, but one of something we used to say a lot is that Democrats manage problems and Republicans solve problems. I like to solve problems. I mean, clearly, immigration is a problem in our country. It's something that cries out for solutions. And from all angles, we should work to further secure our southwest border. Obviously, it's the source of illegal immigration. It's the source of a lot of drugs come in to our country through the southwest border. It's a vulnerability that we have, and we should address it. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. Just like there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that there are about 2.5 million young people in our country who came as children, who grew up here, went to our schools. They speak perfect English. They speak better English than a lot of those of us who were born in this country, and they're excluded. They're not welcomed into the American family. Recognizing those young people, a lot of people call them dreamers, is just an obvious solution that'll be good for our country. I mean, these people pay taxes, they work. They don't know. A lot of them don't know any other country because they haven't even been able to travel because of their status. So they don't even know the countries they were born in. We need to reform our visa program so that it actually complements our economy. We graduate really smart people from schools here and kick them out of the country. I don't know if this is Republican or Democrat, or this is just obvious. And I do know, I remember, Speaker Gingrich used to say this too, like that we're the party, we don't want to manage problems, we want to solve problems. We don't want to manage people's poverty, we want to help them emerge from poverty and become independent and have more choices and options. That's who we are. So I don't know, common sense Republican, moderate, centrist, whatever you want to call it, I just think we need more people in Congress who are there to do the important work that needs to be done, and not just get on television every day and make a name for themselves so that they can run for some other office in the future.
Let me ask you one more question and then we'll end with our lightning round. So many of the issues that we've talked about today have generational disparities in public opinion. You pointed to that on climate change in particular. Where does the Republican Party need to go from here? What should be the future of the GOP to be a party that that's attractive or even a viable option to millennials, Gen Z, and the generation after that?
So I think the future of Republicanism in the United States is a party that embraces free markets, a thriving economy, does not apologize for wanting people to be as prosperous as possible and maximize their God-given potential. And then it's also an inclusive party that judges people or considers people based on their merits, on their contributions to society, on their character, as Dr. King told us, and not on their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, or any of that, right? And it's a party with not a libertarian party, because we want to lead in the world and we want to have a presence in the world because we know the world is best when our country is leading, but certainly domestically we need to just be accepting of the way people want to live their lives, understand that, for example, I'm a Catholic, I have certain beliefs and values, and those are important to me and to my family, but that the government shouldn't be used to impose those on other people. We're seeing the Supreme Court kind of work through all of that, because Congress has not, of course. So I think that's the future of our party, a party that does not apologize for embracing capitalism and meritocracy in our economy and in our society, where those who work the hardest and contribute the most get rewarded for it, but also a party that's accepting and that wants to look like America. Republicans, after 2012, produced a wonderful blueprint for the future of the project, the growth and diversity project for the future of the party, and that's been abandoned. And sometime in the near future, that needs to be readopted, and the commitment has to be solid and firm and say, we are going to do this because it's the best thing for our party, but more importantly, it's the best thing for our country.
Well, I hear a lot of President Reagan's values and principles in there as well. Let's close with our lightning round. We like to ask all of our guests just if they could let us know their favorite Reagan book or speech or quote that informs their own worldview and work.
So the book that I'd like to read the whole thing, but I've only read parts of it, is the Reagan Diaries, and the reason I love it is because it invites you into President Reagan's mind, and it turns out his mind is a very pleasant place because he's just so down to earth and modest. Here's the most powerful man in the world, popular, respected by almost every world leader, and yet he's just a simple American. And I was reinforced when I visited his ranch out in Santa Barbara. So he really liked the simple things in life. And so anyway, that book just opens a window in a very powerful way, and I want to read the whole thing. And then the quote I appreciate the most is the one about, and I don't have it memorized, but the one about us always being just one generation away from losing freedom. We take so much for granted in this country every day. Even as bad as things are today, the freedom to disagree, even in a disagreeable way, which is regrettable, but that is priceless. That is something that people don't get to do throughout the world. And, being free is right up there with having, food and shelter. And my family lost it. So I think I didn't experience it, but I have a special appreciation for it. And President Reagan clearly always did.
Well, that connects right back to where we started and is a great place to end it. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us today. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number one about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.